Thank you for joining us for the evening plenary. This session is going to be a role reversal, where instead of being interviewed, I will be interviewing two of the brightest journalists we have when it comes to thinking about sustainability within fashion. So it is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Kent, who is the Business of Fashion's London editor, and Emily Chan, who is Vogue's sustainability editor. So we're going to have a conversation. We've called this State of Textiles, but it really is just a little bit of a chit-chat about what these guys are hearing. When we're thinking about what would be interesting for the audience, we thought it would be great to hear from two people that are speaking to the leaders in the industry, that are kind of getting the other side of the story, understand some of the themes they're thinking about, and we will also have some time for Q&A. So as we're going, please use the app, put in any questions you have to the Q&A function, and after we have our chat, we should have time to answer some of those. So, without further ado, I would love to start by asking you guys a little bit about what you're hearing. So when we had our kind of pre-call, I made an assumption that you guys were talking to a lot of different people across the industry. So is that the case? What are some of the kind of key themes you're hearing? Sarah, I'll start with you.
So I'm not sure how exciting this will be this month, because often we do, and Emily, I think will agree with me, speak to a lot of different people, but what they're focused on will depend a lot on what is in the news. So this month, it's really been a lot about COP. It's a lot of emissions, much more conversation about nature and biodiversity than there has been previously. We see that bubbling up. But it's really who I've spoken to lately has been dictated a lot by that news flow.
Interesting. Emily?
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. But in terms of, who I speak to on a daily basis, it's a real range of people. It's kind of designers, from CEOs, experts at Textile Exchange, all different types of people, but you do find the same names coming up again, and I think that's something we discussed in our pre-call too, that there are certain designers that are keener than others to talk about sustainability, and it would be great to see more and more people in the industry really engaging in the topic as well.
Can I also say what frustrates me, who I find hard to speak to? I very rarely get to speak to finance people. Not never, that's not fair, but very rarely when I talk to a brand about what they're doing around sustainability, which often requires spending money, will I get to speak to a CFO. Yeah. And I think that says something.
Yeah. I mean, are you getting more senior executives in general, or is it still, like, do you feel like more types of people are starting to engage with the conversation?
Definitely more types of people. Emily, I don't know if you'd agree with this. I think it will depend on the brand, and it will depend what they're talking about. Yeah. Some stuff is really down the weeds. It's very technical, and you kind of just want the expert who is really in that to explain it to you. Certainly smaller brands especially that have really built their businesses around this. You'll find throughout the organization people who are very well-versed and educated and want to speak about this. At bigger brands, the roles are more delineated, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in terms of people at the really top of the major brands, I would say, again, it's a few that I feel really comfortable talking about it, and most of the time it is the kind of sustainability teams otherwise at those really major kind of brands.
So when I was at COP and we were doing the New York Times panel, Vanessa Friedman said that she feels like sustainable fashion is an oxymoron and a concept that we should be removing from our vernacular, because fashion was built around planned obsolescence, and the idea of sustainability confuses things. I think her 2 cents was that responsible fashion would be a maybe different way to talk about it. I think this kind of idea of language, the way that we're classifying these things, how we use the word sustainable versus responsible versus anything. I mean, I feel like as journalists, I'd love to get your sense on, is it an oxymoron? Is it we're already using it? Should we keep on using it? What is the language that really should be behind the conversation we're trying to communicate out to the various audiences you guys represent? Emily, do you want to start?
Yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah.
I think I understand why people think it's an oxymoron, because obviously the idea of fashion is built on kind of trends and cycles and newness, and so I do get that, and I do understand why people kind of are starting to shy away from the term sustainable. I know a lot of brands are kind of making these declarations, we're not a sustainable brand. For me personally, I feel like it's the word we have, and kind of everyone has a basic understanding of sustainability and what this idea of sustainable fashion could be in terms of, sustaining our planet, sustaining our people, and it's kind of an umbrella term where you can have a lot of ideally more specific detail underneath that. But if people are searching, what are they going to search for? It's probably sustainable fashion, sustainability. So I think in terms of the language, I'm personally okay with the term. I think in terms of when we're talking about sustainable fashion, and this has come up in a lot of conversations I have, people kind of see it as an absolute. People, my friends, family will often ask me, is this sustainable, is it not? And obviously, we kind of have to see it more as a, not a black and white concept, kind of looking at the bigger picture. Obviously, products can be more sustainably made, but what we actually do with that product after you've bought it and what happens to that product. So, yeah, I mean, it's a complicated one, but I'm okay with the term.
I think it's really interesting. I agree with a lot of what Emily said. I think it is useful to have an umbrella term. I think when I'm writing about brands or companies, I wouldn't want anyone to go back and read through every story I've done to check if I actually did this. But I try and say sustainably focused, or a brand that is operating in a more sustainable manner, rather than saying a brand is or is not sustainable just because it is such a loose term. I think responsible fashion has the same issue, though. What does it mean to be responsible fashion?
Yeah. Well, and I think this is something we've seen the industry very good at, is we find a new word, and I mean, I'm okay with it as well, but I think it's, we are as an industry very good at marketing. It's not one of the things we're not good at. So I think we can kind of create language quite quickly. So I know, Sarah, the Business of Fashion last year released the Sustainability Index. We're at the start of 2022, yeah? Or no, 2022 is next year, 2020. I wanted to ask you, I know talking to you about it, I know that it was an interesting process. I wanted to get some of your key takeaways. What did you learn trying to kind of understand and create this index?
I think the first thing I learned was humility. It was probably a much more complicated project than we had initially anticipated. It came about because at the start of 2020, I thought it would be a fun beginning of the year story to just do a quick comparison of how different brands were performing. And I was like, well, we'll do a quick look and we'll make some comparisons. It'll be interesting. Everyone wants to know who's doing better, who's doing worse. But actually making, as I think pretty much everyone in this room will know, and a lot of this conference is focused on, those comparisons are really, really hard. People aren't measuring things in the same way. They're not talking about it in the same way. And that's a problem, because then we can't measure where we are and see how we're progressing. We sort of attempted to create a framework to look at this. I think, as with all of these exercises, it's very imperfect. It's based on publicly available data. But what we tried to do that was interesting was think about, when we talk about sustainable, what do we mean? Where are we trying to get to? And we took the Sustainable Development Goals as kind of a baseline and played a kind of thought exercise of, by 2030, what do we want companies to be doing? And then just made a list of questions that would sort of point towards those, and look through companies' documents for an indication to the extent to which they were doing that. And not particularly surprisingly, we have a long way to go. But I think what was interesting was quite how hard it was, how much, not confusion, but how much discussion there still is around basic methodologies and data points, and how much is still focused really on just setting a goal, and a vague goal, without even having a strategy attached to it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I like that you said, that it was a sense of humility, because, I mean, it is hard. And I think the people in this room, the organizations, the first plenary session we had today was about kind of how we do start to connect these different tools that are, trying to set metrics and collect data, but, we as Textile Exchange are looking at raw materials. So that's just one part of it. And how do we, it is an exercise in that. But I like that as a journalist, you now have sat in our seat a little bit and can feel some of the pain of that connection. But It was interesting. I thought it was a great piece of work. Talking to both of you, I think that one thing that would be interesting to understand is that in the time that you've started to cover this topic, in a lot of ways, I think the kind of the mainstream media, and of course, two very different publications you guys represent, we've seen a real uptick even in the last year. But do you think that there's an increased sense of wanting this from your readers? And when you are thinking about that, what are the things that seem to be getting through to readers? What are the sticking things, the sticky things that you get the best feedback from? Emily, do you want to start?
Yeah, definitely in terms of interest, it's on the rise. Our data and analytics team did a survey earlier this year. It found that 69% of our readers think sustainability is an important factor when it comes to making a purchase, which is obviously huge and a big increase. And we've seen that kind of grow during the pandemic as well. So it's interesting to see that stat reflecting some of the conversations that's been happening. In terms of what seems to resonate, our readers really want to know what they can do. They're really looking for answers and black and white answers, really. And they're desperate to do the right thing. And it's another conversation about whether the onus should be so much on the consumers to feel like, they have this personal responsibility, whereas, we know that sustainability should kind of be the baseline. But it's really guides to how to shop more sustainably, looking at different business models, different brands. One really interesting thing that came out of the survey, actually, was that our readers are looking for their favorite brands to adopt more sustainable policies rather than looking elsewhere, which I thought was a really interesting thing to note, because it's kind of a real opportunity for brands as well, in terms of, there is a customer loyalty there, and it's kind of, there's an opportunity there that I feel like they can act on. But there's definitely been increased appetite for sure.
That's great. Sarah, what do you think is getting through to your readers? What are the things that people are actually diving into, wanting more of?
I would say very similar, but because we're a trade publication, it's rather than being, where can I go to buy this stuff? It's what can I do to appeal to those consumers who want to buy that stuff? And, people want to know where the industry is moving, but they also want to know, what do I need to do to move in that direction too?
And I think within that, I think especially within the BOF lens, you are talking to the whole industry, both the people that would be in this room and probably quite a few people that haven't engaged yet as much with sustainability. Do you get questions like that, from companies that are more starting out? Do they ever come to you, or do you get pushed to kind of, or from the way you guys are thinking about it, uncover and help people get more engaged at the early stage, or is it,
That's a really interesting question. We keep a pretty tight firewall between our sort of journalism team and the team that deals with the brands from a non-editorial perspective. So I don't hear about those inbounds if they're coming. I don't know if as we're going out into the world more and less living in silos, I would hear about that more. I think it's an interesting question. It's not really what we're set up to do at the moment.
Fair enough. And Emily, you were just talking a little bit about it a minute ago. There is this kind of desire for black and white answers, and in an area where we know the details are in the gray, and I think a lot of the solutions and nuance of these topics are in the gray. So, how do you translate these? You're at a very technical event. We're probably the nerdiest sustainability event you guys are ever going to be on stage for. But how do you translate these complex issues in a way that can get through to your audience without, falling into the cardinal sin of greenwashing? How do you balance that?
It is a challenge because, as you say, it's such a complex subject and there are no easy solutions, or there aren't black and white answers. So I think it's just by trying to really reflect those nuances to kind of say, if I'm doing a guide on something, this is a better choice, but it's not a perfect solution. For example, recycled polyester is better than virgin polyester, but it's not perfect, and kind of really explaining that and trying to kind of drill down on some of the things that I was saying earlier in terms of, what does sustainability mean? It's not just about consuming more and more sustainable products, and kind of trying to really make that clear that it's about the overall picture. And also reflecting the fact that it shouldn't, as I said before, it shouldn't be about the consumers, and trying to kind of cover the systemic issues in the industry as well, to make it clear that, you know, it's not the responsibility of the consumers just to, do the right thing.
I mean, I do think that's it's a really exciting thing to have a publication like Vogue looking at that. I mean, in the conversations you guys, and what you're thinking about, our keynote speaker this week was really focusing a lot on degrowth. And is that, that idea of reuse, secondhand, is that something that's coming into the kind of editorial conversation and sustainability conversation at all?
Yeah, it's definitely something we're covering a lot. And I think that you can see by the kind of rise in the amount of companies that are looking at resale and rental as well, there's a lot of interest around it. And yeah, it's definitely part of the conversation, and people are looking at alternatives now, which I think is really exciting for the industry.
Yeah, I do too. Sarah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this this balance of striking between simplification and not overwhelming people with the detail.
I mean, I think our job as journalists is to explain things clearly, but that doesn't mean we can't be nuanced, and that's what we have to be. But I do want to say something on the degrowth and resale point, because I think it's a huge story, and more brands are doing it, and it's a really successful business model at the moment. For them, it's not a degrowth conversation at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess, because the way we've been trying to talk about it is degrowth in the way that we're removing the year-on-year increase of new raw materials. And I think you can still have profitable growth without increased new.
Totally.
And I think that's really where it gets interesting.
That is where it gets interesting. I've yet to see that happening in practice. And I do think that there is a possibility that actually this just becomes a secondary layer of revenue without reducing the primary market. But we'll see.
Are you going to dig into that?
We've done a few stories on this, but at the moment it's also a tricky one, because it's a little bit it's a little bit speculative, because it could go that way, it could go the other way. So I think it's more when people. It's about, again, having that nuance in there of, this is a really exciting opportunity. It could be transformative, but there is a risk that it's not.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about this a little bit before, but the kind of role you think journalists have to play in it too, versus do you think it's your job to be out there, pushing for in that way, kind of judging it versus covering it? Where do you see your role in that?
I think different publications see it differently, but for me, we're not an advocacy group. We're reporting on the industry, and what I just said, I wouldn't say that's judging it. I'm not being critical. I'm just saying, this is what is happening. It's analysis and commentary and explaining things, rather than just having it be through the lens of the press release.
Yeah. And both of you were at COP26, or we were covering COP26. Emily, you were at COP26. I wanted to get your take on it, from a journalist point of view. What do you think it means for the industry? What were your kind of key takeaways? Emily, I'd love to start with you.
I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. I think it's great to see the kind of ambition level rising in terms of, cutting emissions. We know we need that. It was great to see the specific commitments around materials, around phasing out coal. But again, it's about the action and how we actually get there, and how companies are going to achieve those targets, as you were kind of saying, Sarah. We know that there's a massive funding gap, which I believe was covered in one of your panels, the $1 trillion funding gap in terms of decarbonisation across the supply chain. I know that Textile Exchange is kind of calling for policy change in terms of really incentivizing companies to make the right choices in terms of materials. So, yeah, I think it's about how we get there now. And it's great to see that fashion had such a strong presence at COP, which I don't think has been the same in previous years, and I feel like there's a real acknowledgement kind of in the mainstream. We had Boris Johnson giving a message at the BFC event. Prince Charles is obviously really interested in this area, so it's great to see people understanding how important fashion is when it comes to reducing global emissions. But it's where does the hard work happen now? And we've got to see how it goes.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's significant. From my observations, that's probably the most fashion engagement at an event of that level at the geopolitical stage that I've ever seen. And I think that is significant. I would expect to see that continuing. I think, Textile Exchange obviously leading a call for more policy engagement is important. And aligning with a 1.5 degree pathway is also significant, but it's interesting that the most ambitious the industry could get at this point is aligning with the goal that the entire world has been trying to move towards since 2015.
Yeah, and I think it was great that we had the updated charter. I think there is that progress, but we know, like you said, we've got to figure out now the actions that actually get us there. So we've got some questions coming in on the app, and I should say, the reason I'm on my phone up here is not because I'm on Twitter. It's because that's how we're obviously gathering the questions. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you both. You are dealing with, us as an industry. What is your ask back? What will make your jobs easier in covering this? Or, I guess easier? What are the things that you want to ask back out to the brands, the suppliers, the people that are sharing press releases? How is it that we can continue to communicate this?
I think for me, it's greater transparency. We were just having a conversation before we came onto stage about kind of communications between comms teams and sustainability teams. And, quite often I'll get a press release and it'll say something like, this collection contains sustainable denim. And then I ask the team, what makes it sustainable? And they have to go back and ask, and it takes them a couple of days to get back to me, and they should really be speaking and know, what about their denim is sustainable. So I feel like greater transparency in terms of, brands actually telling us directly what they're doing. There's often a lot of kind of marketing speak and kind of vagueness in the language. So more specifics in terms of what they're actually doing, and then, greater communication. And then on another point, I think good data is something that would definitely make my life a lot easier, and probably yours too, Sarah, because as we know, there are statistics that are often quoted over and over again that don't come from reliable sources, or they're decades old, and really good, reliable data would, make my life a lot easier.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I would also love a TLDR in every press release that I get.
Tell people what a TLDR is.
Sorry, it's too long, don't read. Basically, a very short synopsis of what I need to know from the email.
Okay, so those two things. It sounds like you're asking for better connectivity between the people that are trying to tell you the stories and the people that are out there kind of representing the stories. And yes, top line. So one of the questions that we've had come in is around how we can really help educate customers. And I think, and I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts on the different roles that, those of us in the room have to play when it comes to educating the market. You as journalists, brands, how do we start to solve that issue around consumer education? Sarah?
So indirect answer.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that a lot of what we've heard up here is that the consumer actually cares a lot about this and knows a lot about it. So why do we need to focus on educating the consumer? Obviously, there are nuances and details that would be really helpful, but is that the right place to focus immediately? And added to that, brands have huge budgets for marketing, so put your money into that, I think, is the answer.
Emily, you want to add?
I think it's super interesting. I think that in terms of where I see my role as being, I do feel that consumers want to understand the issues around sustainability better, and there are still a lot of people that are coming to the subject kind of fresh. They don't have the basic understandings. They don't, things like the fact that viscose comes from trees, they don't know that. So I think it is really getting consumers up to speed with the basics, but also kind of, there needs to be a culture change. I think we kind of as an industry have acknowledged that there needs to be a culture change. And obviously those things take time, but I think it's education around thinking differently about the way we consume fashion, really. I think that's something that we're focusing a lot on at Vogue. And it's not just about the nitty-gritty, but also kind of creating cultural change as well.
Yeah, and I've heard Lucy Shea talk about that as well, who's the CEO of Futera Communications Agency based out of London that has done a lot of work on this, is that we do need to now see a larger cultural shift. And that, that's, I think, can be led a lot by the work that you guys do, but I know that it's not any one actor's responsibility either. I think one of the really interesting things that happened at COP as well that wasn't as covered as much because it wasn't presented in as big of a way maybe was the communication guidelines work that came out, which was something that was done through UNEP, which was around asking companies to align their communications to a 1.5 degree pathway. Were either of you, are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
What did you think about that?
I think it's really interesting, and I think actually Emily gave a really smart, nuanced response to that question. Which, so I haven't had a chance to really dig deep into the guidelines yet, but I do think it is important, and I think it plays into regulation that is coming. Yeah. There is much stronger regulation around greenwashing coming, so brands and all of us need to be thinking much more carefully about how we use language. I think that's really important.
Yeah. No, I would agree, and I think it's really great that there is a focus on the communication aspect because, that's how you engage with consumers. And I agree, in terms of a real shift, it probably will take some sort of standardization in terms of how brands display this information across the board. And I think that it feels like that is coming, but kind of focusing on the way that brands are communicating with their consumers is important because, as you say, there is so much greenwashing out there, and it's confusing. It's confusing for people. So to get a real shift, we kind of need a standardized way of kind of presenting information, I think.
Yeah. And one of the things you just said a minute ago as well, I'm curious, I think we forget a lot of the times, especially in these rooms, like we are so in it that there is kind of a basic education still missing in the marketplace. Is that something that should be done, kind of at the beginning of everything? Do we need to, when you're writing a story about, whatever it might be, is that kind of how you're trying to frame it? That this is, first of all, just to remind everybody, viscose comes from trees, it's a cellulose, this is what that means. Is that part of the communication you're thinking about and trying to bring that baseline into each story? Do you think we've got a long way to go on that still? Is that something we're going to keep on having to do for a while?
When I'm writing a story, I try not to assume knowledge and really kind of drill down, explain everything. So even, what is COP26? I think a lot of people before the past month wouldn't have known what COP20, certainly our readers, a lot of them wouldn't have known what COP26 was. So I think trying to not assume knowledge is really important in terms of our target audience, kind of, not alienating anyone. And then you can get into the nitty-gritty, but kind of, not assuming knowledge at the moment, I think.
And so, again, you have a very different audience, but even amongst, I guess, the folks reading BOF and industry folks, is that similar, you feel?
Yeah, I think as a journalist, I see your role is to explain things in a way that is as accessible as possible. And I used to work at the Wall Street Journal, and we used to say all the time, imagine you're sort of sitting in a pub, in the middle of nowhere and telling the barman or barwoman the story, and you have to make it accessible to that person.
Yeah, I know because I know you a little bit, but I know that you used to cover commodities in general. Are there any interesting parallels, having come out of a very different space into the fashion space? Are there things you think we can learn as an industry from the kind of the world that you covered previously?
It's hard to make full comparisons because they're so different. It's a world of engineers, so you want to get into data. I'm not saying that the data is perfect by any means, and they're very used to manipulating it to say what they want. But data abounds, an analysis of that data abounds. So that I miss a lot, and I also think that because it was oil and gas, so it was a commodity that's really been a focus of this conversation around climate change. So they've faced much longer and more public pressure to change. They've had their investors pushing them harder. So I think that's driven the conversation along faster. There's still obviously a really long way to go. I also think they're used to being the bad guy.
Yeah.
And fashion, wants to be on a pedestal because it's desirable, it's aspirational. It's not used to being, doing, the one damaging the planet and having to deal with that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, and I've said this a lot, but I really think that fashion can, because it is so focused on what's desirable, change what desirable means. That I think that the fashion community has the opportunity to rethink what, is desirable the next season every time, or is desirable something that is durable, something that can last, something that has inherent value, something that's secondhand. I mean, I do think that, like you said, those marketing budgets are big. And so if they get, used towards kind of redefining that, actually replacing a business unit, it can be an exciting space. I mean, is that something you feel like, coming from, a publication like Vogue, like, is that something you feel like you guys are ready to kind of help lean into?
I think definitely fashion has a role to play when it comes to cultural change, as I was saying before. And I think this idea of creativity, I was doing a panel with Gabriella Hurst at COP as well, and with Daniel Hermer, chef, and Dustin Yellen, artist. And it was really about kind of the role of creatives when it comes to looking at the climate crisis, which I thought was a really interesting angle to look at it from. Because I think so much of the discussion about sustainability is around how to make things less bad and kind of reducing impacts. And that conversation was very much about kind of imagination and imagining a better future and really imagining new ways of doing things. And I think fashion has a huge role to play in terms of that. And that's a side of the conversation that we don't hear about as much, kind of the need to, the need for creativity, really.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left, so I'd love to get any kind of final thoughts from you guys out to our audience. We're talking about fibers and materials here today, so I'm sure you hear a lot about different initiatives on fibers and materials from brands. So any kind of final thoughts, and again, any kind of things you'd like to put back out to our community around how to cut through the noise, how to make these things feel meaningful, because you are an amplifier to the work that we're trying to do here. Emily, can I start with you?
I think, it's really about how do we best communicate the work, the organizations that you're doing to our readers and really manage to kind of distill it. And I do think this kind of move towards kind of standardized models or labeling is really helpful, because if everyone's kind of working off the same page, that makes it easier to communicate. At the moment, it feels like there's a lot of work going on around behind the scenes, which is brilliant, but how do we kind of distill it all? And then I would reiterate my call for good data, because that's something that I feel is really necessary for the industry in terms of moving forward too.
Well, we'd be happy to know that those are things we're talking about this week on both fronts. Our partners are looking at that consolidated labeling, and I think we're all as an industry very focused on data. I can definitely speak for Textile Exchange. We're very focused on improving data in 2022. Sarah?
Yeah, I think data would be amazing. Yeah. What else? I feel like, I think part of what you're asking is, what are we looking for? So I would say for me, kind of stories that we're doing, that we're writing, we want to explain what is going on, and we want to move forward the conversation in a way that makes people feel like they've learned something new. So something, a piece of news that's really significant for a company, where they're doing something new, is amazing. But it may not work for us, the news story, because we've written about it before. It's not speaking to a wider trend yet. So thinking about what you're doing means in a broader context when sort of coming to us is helpful.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for being with us today. I think it's really interesting to get this side of the kind of this view from this side. Again, you play a very important role in all of our work, and so really grateful for you being here today. So please, a round of applause for our panel.
Thank you for having us.